Hi, I'm James Patrick, the director of Big Picture.Watch. I'd like to introduce you today to a woman named Brook Jackson. She was a Pfizer whistleblower. She worked for a firm called Ventavia, which was a subcontractor under Pfizer. She oversaw part of the clinical trials to approve the Pfizer vaccine. She saw enough fraud and corruption to invalidate her part of the trial, which was big enough to invalidate the entire approval of the product. She in turn sued the government for purchasing these shots because they weren't properly FDA approved. Pfizer's initial response to the claim was that their products were not authorized by FDA, but authorized by the military as countermeasure prototype demonstrations. Let's hear what she experienced in this interview.
So my name is Brook Jackson. I am a clinical research professional. I have been in the industry for about 20 years, and I've spent a lot of time, my area of expertise would be in gastroenterology, hepatology, infectious disease, and vaccine.
So could you tell me your story again?
So I was working for a company called Ventavia Research Group. Ventavia was tasked by Pfizer, who delegated some of their clinical trial responsibilities to outside contractors. So I was working for one of those contractors at the clinical site level, so where patients were being recruited to participate in Pfizer's phase 3 vaccine trial for COVID-19. In total, there were 153 clinical trial sites across the globe. There were 131 in the United States. So I was a regional director for 2 of those clinical trial sites. My responsibilities were to just manage the day-to-day clinical operations, the staff that was overseeing, the data collection, the principal investigators or study doctors that were over the trial, monitoring these patients from the moment they signed informed consent through the completion of their journey in the clinical trial.
And what did you observe when you worked there?
I observed a lot, and I was only employed for 18 days, and that included weekends. My start date was September 7th of 2020, and my termination date was September 25th of 2020, so 18 days total. I walked in the door excited to be a part of this product's development. I am not an anti-vaxxer. My kids are fully up to date on every single one that's recommended in the childhood schedule. We typically got our flu shots. My mind is forever changed now that I've watched kind of this vaccine rollout, because there's this need to vaccinate. And I don't fully understand everything that's behind that. And so knowing that I don't understand it gives me pause. I had worked with COVID very early on in the pandemic. I was traveling to different sites in my former job as a director of operations and worked on the rapid test development of the point of care devices, the rapid tests that tell you whether you're positive or negative or if it's an invalid result. So I worked on that, and I just got tired of the travel and being away from my family. So I looked for something that was closer to home and found Ventavia Research Group. So I knew that people were getting sick. I knew that patients were dying, and the possibility that this vaccine was going to be the end to all of that was exciting for me. I've been in clinical research for 20 years. I've watched drugs and vaccines and devices go from those early stages of clinical development into what we use as standard of care today. And so I was excited. I was happy to be there and bring my 20 years of experience. From the start at Ventavia, day one, I recognized misconduct, certainly. Things were happening from day one. But when I walked in, I was really trying to get an understanding of just how their clinic flowed on the day-to-day, get to know the staff that I was going to be overseeing. I'd already studied the clinical trial protocols for Pfizer's vaccine, so I was familiar with what the requirements were and the steps that needed to be followed. And so me going into Ventavia, my job was really just to make sure that those standard operating procedures we had as a company were being followed, that in the conduct of these studies that we were following Pfizer's protocol, that if we ever deviated from that protocol, we were following the appropriate steps to ensure that Pfizer was notified and that the ethics committees and institutional review boards were notified as well. So walking in there, I'm finding those things were not being done. So that was from day one. I mean, I found things and I started reporting those things from day one.
From day one of the 18 days, huh? And so can you walk me through this 18 days briefly?
Yeah.
You know,
so day one, the first thing that when I step back and I look at Ventavia, their clinic was small. They were understaffed and not prepared to run a clinical trial at the speed and overall size. They promised that they were able to enroll a certain amount of patients and be able to handle those patients and monitor them appropriately, and that they were working way beyond their scope. I was hired to go in with my experience in clinical research and my certifications as a clinical trial auditor. I go in and I'm looking for problems. That's my job, but also to manage people in their day-to-day, 9 to 5. So, going in, I'm finding, the informed consents are not being given appropriately. We are mixing up lab specimens. We are not following protocol that was developed by Pfizer. There were so many things. I really cannot list them all to you.
And why are all these things important?
The integrity of the data that is collected from the site level is what's used to ultimately determine a product's safety and efficacy. So I knew at the very, very beginning that we're trying to get a vaccine to stop a world pandemic. And we're enrolling patients into the study, and the data that we're collecting is going to be used to determine this product's safety and efficacy. So it has to be right. There's no room for error. And that's what Pfizer's clinical trial is full of. Error, it's full of fraud. And I watched it and found it with my own 2 eyes. What I saw was so egregious, and I knew, maybe not at the time, how much the data collected at Ventavia could potentially affect the overall outcome of Pfizer's study, but I knew that it was important enough that I needed to say something, and I made a call to the FDA on the 25th of September of 2020 and was directed to send an email. And I sent an email and listed out 14 different findings that I had just in the few days that I was able to audit Ventavia's data.
And then how soon after that were you fired?
6 hours. 6 hours later, I was fired.
And what does that quick time period tell you?
It tells me that once I made the call to the FDA and they were aware of what was going on at Ventavia, they made a call to Pfizer and Pfizer made a call to Ventavia, and I lost my job because, according to Ventavia, I was not a good fit.
And do you think that was legitimate?
True.
Yeah.
Yes, I think it's true. I was not a good fit because I was not complicit to what they were doing. I refused to be a part of it. I remember a phone call that I received about me declining an invitation to a call that was being scheduled, and the title of this call and this meeting was COVID cleanup call. And I knew what that meant. They wanted to talk about how to clean up the problems, and I just refused to be a part of it.
And why was that?
Because I refused to be part of fraudulent data being submitted to the FDA in support of a vaccine that I didn't know was going to be safe or effective.
So like it couldn't have been cleaned up, you're saying?
No, it could not have been cleaned up. You're absolutely right. What I believe should have happened is that Pfizer should have excluded the data collected at Ventavia and moved forward from there. Their data should not have been included in the overall analysis of whether or not this vaccine is safe or effective. I got vaccinated myself in January of 2021 because I was not looking at I wasn't looking at the technology itself. From my view, it was the way the trials were conducted. I had to trust the FDA. And although I got fired for making that call, I still just had not put it together. I mean, I'd never been fired before. I was going through so much at that time, trying to look for another job and just all these things that were going on in my head. Just knowing that there are companies out there that conduct studies like this. I'd never seen it in my 20 years. And I've been a part of some huge clinical trials. You hear about it in your annual trainings, and you read about it in Department of Justice news and press releases that these things happen, but I'd never personally seen it. So when I experienced it and told the FDA and then lost my job for doing that, it still just didn't click. I thought, well, maybe this was already coming. Maybe my termination was already in the works. I was bringing things to their attention. I was refusing to be a part of some calls just based on the agenda. I didn't make it a secret what I found. It was not a secret, the implication of what Ventavia was doing. I was so vocal about. Before I made the determination to recommend as Ventavia's regional director to stop enrolling in Pfizer's trial, you stop what you're doing right now. You tell Pfizer, and we pause and look at, one, how are we going to protect the patients that are already in the trial? What have we done to them in terms of their safety, their welfare, and their rights? What can we do to help these patients right now? There was no regard for that. They weren't looking at that. They were looking at, what can we do to hide what we've done?
So what does this mean for the average person taking a Pfizer shot then? What does your story tell them?
My story says that the conduct of the clinical trial was so rushed. Pfizer's need to be first to market was evident in the way that they conducted the trial, in my experience. Again, there was no regard for those things that we should just have a basic need to do to protect patients. These are volunteers who are volunteering themselves to science. It's a novel product. It's a novel coronavirus. And these brave people are standing up and saying, I'll take it. Sign me up.
And they were getting deceived, or what? Why are you speaking out now or pursuing this case?
For a bunch of reasons, James. I think, number one, what I witnessed was fraud, period. I know what I saw in the clinical trial went against everything that I've been taught my entire career. I'm angry. I've been angry, one, because I got fired for telling the truth. I got fired for coming forward. That makes me angry. I am angry because I spoke to Pfizer, although I did that anonymously. I let them know what was going on in their clinical trial. They did nothing. I went to the FDA. I lost my job because of that. I then went to the Department of Justice and tried to explain to them what I saw, even filed a lawsuit against Pfizer. And to this day, nothing. So my claim is that based on the clinical trial fraud that occurred at just 2 of these clinical trial sites, although it was just 1,000 patients, that those 1,000 approximate patients could have changed the outcome of the study in terms of safety and efficacy.
Okay.
And where they failed FDA, Pfizer, they never even investigated my allegations. I told Pfizer, this is happening. I told the FDA, this is happening. I told the Department of Justice, this is happening. And everybody's ignored me. They've done nothing. There have been no investigations done. None. So I think what the average everyday person should take away from this is, from the very beginning, from the data that they talk about all the time, I'm telling you that it's wrong and it's fraudulent, it's fabricated, it's made up, it doesn't jive. And this product essentially is misbranded. It's not as safe as they say it is. It's not as effective as they say it is. And I'm suing on behalf of those claims, on behalf of every American citizen. We paid for this product. We paid for this vaccine. Your taxpayer dollars paid for it. And there's fraud there. And Pfizer's defense is that based on the contract that they signed with the Department of Defense, that they did not have to follow any of the standard regulations that govern contracts, and they did not have to follow any of the standards that govern clinical trials. The only terms of the agreement between Pfizer and the Department of Defense was that they bring an FDA-approved product to market. They did that, and they achieved that through fraudulent clinical trials.
So what you saw in our reporting invalidates the entire clinical trial of Pfizer?
It could. Yes. When you look at, again, that number of patients that were, 44,000, Ventavia had 1,000. Your efficacy of 95% is based on 170 patients.
Out of 40,000.
Out of 44,000.
So explain that real quick. So out of 40,000 people, they said that they found. Can you just say?
Yeah. So out of approximately 44,000 patients, 170 of those determined their efficacy, which was 95%. They said, this vaccine is safe and effective, and it's 95% effective.
Is 95% of 170?
That was the number of patients that they based their efficacy on. 170 out of 44,000 that developed COVID during their participation. 8 patients in the vaccine group got COVID. 162 in the placebo group got COVID. So they're saying that because only 8 in the vaccine arm got COVID and 162 got COVID in the placebo arm. That makes our vaccine 95% effective. From September of 2020 through December of 2020, when they received their authorization, the protocol was changed 4 times.
Is that normal?
Protocols change, yes. I've worked on some very complex clinical trials in, the setting of transplant and hepatitis C. So complex studies. So yes, protocols change all the time. But it was like the protocol for Pfizer's vaccine changed as they realized they weren't meeting a specific efficacy endpoint, or they were changing they were moving the goalpost is what they were doing.
Is that typical?
No.
Is that considered fraudulent? Or
No.
Could that be considered fraudulent?
Not sure yet. Not sure yet. We're looking at that piece. So I'm not sure.
Why is your job so important?
The data that's collected from patients at the site level is the information and data that's used by the pharmaceutical company, and in this case, Pfizer. They take that data and they present it to the FDA. And at that point, the FDA will make a determination whether a product is safe and effective. If they're taking data that they know is fabricated, it's falsified, it's invalid, and present it to the FDA, that's fraud, period.
So what would you like to see come from all this, from your case?
It's accountability for Ventavia to be held responsible for what they did, Icon to be responsible for their role, and for Pfizer to be held accountable for what they did. When you make the claim that this is safe and effective, you're promising me that. That's your promise to me, the FDA. You promise that if I give this to my children, they're going to be protected. They're not going to transmit the virus to my grandparents when we go see them in their nursing home. That was the initial claim.
And you experienced them just kind of rushing through? Or what?
Absolutely.
How would you characterize what you experienced in the work?
A rush to be first to market. When you look at Pfizer's emergency use authorization and when they were granted that happened on December 11th of 2020. Moderna was right behind them. They received their emergency use authorization on the 18th of December 2020. So there was just a rush to be number one. And they were willing to do anything. And they did. They sacrificed their entire trial being number one. When all they had to do, we're talking about 1,000 patients. In the overall 44,000, 1,000 is not a lot. It can change the outcome, but why include them in your analysis? Just exclude them and continue with your enrollment.
And just continue. Get more data.
Don't use this data that's been made up and you cannot trust. We talk about this COVID-19 cartel and how that involves our regulators and our mainstream media and our big tech. And I'm like, wow, how long has this actually been going on? Have I been completely asleep at the wheel for the last 20 years? I don't want to give clinical research a bad name because we should never stop looking for an answer, a better way of doing something. So I don't want to give research a bad name, but it's changed my perspective. I went from trusting completely to not trusting at all. And that's hard. It's hard for me to admit that not only did I trust so willingly, but that I've also been vaccinated with a COVID-19 vaccine. I chose to, in early January of 2021, take the Moderna vaccine for COVID. And I did that because I fell for, I think, what most people have fallen for, and that is they're afraid of dying. I'm afraid of dying. I don't want to die alone. Well, I think I regret it now because these vaccines have been proven to not be safe, and they've proven not to be effective. People are dying from taking this vaccine. And now I have no idea what it's doing to my body. And I'm 45. I'm okay with, I've had a great life. I guess if something happens to me, that's what happens to me. But what about these children that we're putting this vaccine? This is our future. Women are pregnant and being advised to get these products injected into their body. We have no idea what it's doing to their baby. We have no idea what it's doing for their future, their future children. I don't want a penny from this lawsuit, and there are many pennies. I mean, we're talking about billions of dollars, millions of dollars that I would be entitled to if we were successful here. I don't want to touch it. To me, it's like blood money, right? But I do want that to be used for people who've been injured by this vaccine. I have met I've met more than that, but two people in this journey of mine have affected my life in ways that I haven't even begun to fully place or process yet. And both of those people were vaccine injured. I met my first vaccine injured person. And I won't say her name, but it was in November of 21. And I was in DC. And I had on a wool jacket. And I see a lady get off the bus, and we were going to a rally. And I see her get off the bus, and she has on a jacket, but it's not a heavy jacket. And she's shaking uncontrollably, and using a walker. Shaking uncontrollably, and I thought, "Aw, she's cold." That's the first thing that I thought, was that she was cold. So I took off my jacket, and I walked over to her, and I put it on her. And she said, "Oh, that's okay, bro." She didn't know my name. "That's okay. This is how I live my life every day. I'm vaccine injured."
Yeah.
And I thought, damn. This vaccine, James, was going to be used to stop this pandemic. We needed a vaccine. We needed it in a hurry. It was going to get you back to your family. It was going to get you back to your job. It was going to get us back to normal, and it was completely the opposite.